Breath of the Wild, released back in the Halcyon before times, was a very bold reinvention of what a Zelda game could be. Now coming up on being 4 years old, excuse me, panic set in. It set some very high bars for both the completely oversaturated open-world sandbox market and some less flattering ones for inventory management. It also is one of my favorite games, and now that Breath of the Wild has had a full 4-year dev cycle to fully exert its influence, we're seeing a lot of developers make games that take fairly substantial cues from its success, and any game trying to emulate Breath of the Wild is, in my eyes, doing something right. I mean, behold a quick behind the scenes of my first playthrough in an unreleased first impressions video I made back in 2017. And by inventory, I do mean inventory. Look at that! Look how cool this is! I'm, like, giddy. I am giddy with delight at this video game. Look how much fun he's having. If only he knew. This may sound antithetical considering what I just said, but I came into mobile game developer MiHoYo's latest opus, Genshin Impact, expecting to be sorely disappointed and disillusioned with what I was positive was going to be a low-quality microtransaction-riddled clone of Breath of the Wild. That said, were large swaths of it not based on Breath of the Wild, I wouldn't have even installed it in the first place, so I suppose it worked on some level. I mean, good lord, the always-on kernel-level anti-cheat alone had a hell of an uphill battle to fight to reach the barest level of acceptance from me, and the fact I even started playing it at all is pretty stunning. I'm sure the Chinese analysts are desperately prowling through my internet history, judging me for rewatching Gurren Lagann for the 8th time instead of the Made in Abyss film. Tech otakus save the world, MiHoYo proudly exclaim every time the game is launched, a rather grandiose feat they apparently intend to achieve by creating a game that adapts the design philosophies of one of Nintendo's hottest releases to better suit what is effectively a gambling system. I feel as though this is a rather roundabout way to achieve that admittedly lofty goal. Perhaps it's more of a plea than a mission statement. In light of the game's recent update to patch 1.2, which includes the first major map addition and removes my favorite low-res landmark, it was pertinent to do a quick review of the game now that they've found their feet somewhat. So, Genshin. I think under the interests of an unbiased fair review and all that, calling it a free-to-play Breath of the Wild clone with gacha systems would be a bit reductive. There's a lot more going on under the hood here than just Link's most recent traipse through Hyrule with a gachapon machine stapled to it, and as a result, I will refrain from mentioning Breath of the Wild again for the duration of this review. Just kidding, Genshin Impact is a free-to-play Breath of the Wild clone with gacha systems, which at first blush does definitely sound like saying it's relaxing in a lounge chair with invasive unanesthetized dental surgery, and I'm certainly not going to defend the addition of withholding a decent amount of content behind an RNG paywall, but to judge a book by its cover is to be a bad internet armchair critic, even if that book charges you money for a random chance at being able to read Chapter 16, and as we all know, Chapter 16 is always the best one. You know, on that note, I've noticed that people seem to get very angry when someone says the game's copied Link's latest Odyssey almost wholesale, despite it wearing its influences not even on its sleeve. It's just wearing a plain white t-shirt with a picture of Breath of the Wild's box art and the words "We did our best" written in black Sharpie above it. Even the developers themselves released a statement in response to the comparison saying, no, we're not Breath of the Wild, the combat's different, see? The only parts of the game more blatant than the inspiration taken from Link's most recent trudge through Hyrule are the posteriors of the majority of the female cast when they're paragliding. I don't really see the issue in the comparison myself. I mean, MiHoYo certainly didn't, and this is speaking as someone to whom that game was an unforgettable, mesmerizing experience. By all means, please copy Breath of the Wild. Rip that game off like you're a struggling Hollywood screenwriter. It's been 4 years. We could all use another dose of Breath of the Wild. But it is certainly very easy to just say Genshin's a clone and call it a day, just like all those geniuses with Doom clones back in the late 90s. It paraglides like Breath of the Wild. It climbs like Breath of the Wild. It increases stamina used for both of those actions via donations to statues of deities like Breath of the Wild. It has instance challenge dungeons accessed by shrines that turn from blue to red upon interaction like Breath of the Wild, so on and so forth. It does differ in quite a few areas other than the gacha system, most notably how it utilizes its gameplay systems and recontextualizes the experience as more of a JRPG, equipment menus, party compositions, and differing skill sets to name a few, and by itself the combat can, at times, be more engaging than Breath of the Wild. It can also be far less engaging, but that's mostly due to the more binary nature of conflict. It also has a cast of fun but largely one-dimensional characters to, massive open quotes here, choose between, in the same way I might choose to be struck by lightning. As much as I might try to tip the odds in my favor, ultimately it is still up to Zeus whether or not I get to experience that particular thrill. Speaking of lightning, every character possesses an element and a weapon type: cryo, geo, pyro, animo, electro, hydro, and dendro, and bows, swords, spears, claymores, and catalysts, and these two aspects define what kind of playstyle best suits them, but fundamentally the most important part of combat is inflicting an enemy with the element type the character you're controlling is possessed of, say pyro, and then switching to another character of a different element to cause a reaction with that element. Every element interacts in ways that seem more or less straightforward. Pyro and Dendro cause a severe burning status that rapidly chips away at health. Cryo and Hydro causes the creature afflicted to be frozen to the spot for a few moments. Electro and Pyro causes an overloaded status that causes huge burst damage, etc., etc. The acquisition and composition of your 4-person squad is what dictates your combat approach, so there's a decent degree of variation and strategy here, ignoring the fact that most fights play out identically since there's only 7 or so non-mini boss enemy types in the game. I find the basic movement a bit sluggish too, everything's a little bit stiff. The pauses between climbing jumps feels like it's a split second too long, the delay between picking up items is long, it feels like everything's about 15% slower than it should be. Miraculously, having 2 Animo users in your party increases movement speed by 15%, which makes controlling your character feel much snappier, but that dictates the element of half of your party, and as of time of writing, the only way to have 2 Animo users in your party is by rolling a very cute 4-star wind user Sucrose in the gacha, and either having the protagonist stay in Animo form or having one of the extremely rare Animo 5 stars in your party, something that almost everyone playing this game is not going to be capable of. It's sad to see how easily increasing the movement speed by a mere 15% makes it feel much more responsive to play, but doing so requires both luck and sacrificing a party slot to have 2 characters of the same element in play simultaneously, which in theory kills a great deal of combat options. It's also quite subjective. This further wrinkle can be resolved by having your parties split into a traversal team and a combat team, but since all combat that isn't instanced is going to happen during the course of traversal, trips across the overworld usually have me running away from every enemy I see since I'm less equipped to deal with them. Fortunately, I can always run away 15% faster. It has a rather bare-bones story as of patch 1.2, and this is something that I very much hope will increase in quality and scope as time progresses. Expecting me to care about a lost sibling that has precisely 1 line of dialogue in the opening 10 seconds of the game is a bit presumptuous. God knows, it took my real sister at least 100 before I felt compelled to find her after she got lost in London on our way to watch Hamilton. But the story seems to be more about the relations with a vaguely villainous faction known as the Fatui, who dress in all black and enjoy stealing chess pieces from femboys. I'm certainly not very compelled by it currently, although who can say what exciting directions they might take with it down the road in what I like to call the Final Fantasy XIV / Dragon Quest XI / Fate Grand Order school of narrative structure. All the dialogue is fairly well localized by that token, a few peculiar choices here and there, but certainly it's not totally slipshod, and it can be funny too.
I definitely have breast cancer.
The sheer amount of writing on display here reveals a shockingly deep commitment to the lore and history for the world they're building, but when a side quest with already paltry rewards requires you to read a long excerpt from an instructional guide for prospective knights, I wonder if the effort was worth it, especially with the burden that translating all of this must place on localization. The sensation I felt when I realized every single glowing interactable spot in Mondstadt's library was a 1,000 or so word long book, was probably the closest I'll likely ever come to experiencing that frenzy effect from Bloodborne in real life. At risk of using appropriately malign journalist rhetoric, it remains to be seen if MiHoYo will continue keeping their major content releases global, or if the localization efforts will result in a more staggered release of new content on a language-to-language basis. My bilingual friends have led me to believe that English is quite a stupid language. The turn of phrase that most comes to mind for me when playing Genshin is style over substance, so it's very fortunate that the style is, at times, breathtaking. At certain angles, from certain viewpoints, Genshin Impact is an absurdly pretty game. Important acknowledgements must be made to the infamous texture smear that was the largest feature on the map thus far, but I had learned to embrace and later adore what I'd since affectionately dubbed PS2 Mountain. And it looked garbage, and it was, you could walk to it and like you could stand at the foot of that PS2 Mountain, and you could laugh and enjoy that. You know, you mocked it at first. It was like Rich Evans. It's the Rich Evans of mountains.
Yeah.
Rich Evans laugh, it pierces your skull, and you go, oh my god, this is unlistenable. But then as time wears on, you go, I love this. I love PS2 Mountain. This game is
I'm
enhanced.
not quite there with Rich Evans laugh yet, but I know what you mean.
There is, of course, a significant difference between the way a game looks and the way a game plays. There's a lot of smaller touches missing, like how in, I don't know, let's just say Breath of the Wild, climbing ladders doesn't drain stamina, or if you shoot a ball with a fire arrow, it drops cooked meat. Very little of that here. There's no chemistry system. The mechanics don't mesh in the borderline miraculous way that some other games did, but even if it feels like it's missing a bit of the heart that game had, you can get a very real sense of the love poured into the design of certain areas by the developers. At time of writing, Genshin's playable map consists of two countries. There's Mondstadt and the Dragonspine mountain range, which are a rather generic, traditionally European fantasy romp, very similar in nature to probably another game whose name I forget. And then there's the I can't believe this game was made in China, Liyue, whose development was probably funded in part by the Beijing Tourism Bureau. In fairness, it's not as though the apparent favoritism hasn't paid off on at least some levels. The Wangshu Inn and Chinyang Peak are absolutely wonderful areas, enough so that they actively made me stop for a few minutes just to absorb it all in via osmosis. They're not particularly thrilling to navigate, and saying there's a lot to do in either place would be a lie, but you'd have to be a more cynical person than I not to get here, set to this music, and find it anything short of beautiful. Then again, I have a sort of predilection for this kind of environment, I suppose. Not for nothing is my favorite level in Spyro 3, at least visually, Bamboo Terrace. When you couple that with my unforgettable memories of Dynasty Warriors 3, unparalleled work of storytelling genius that it is, you have a sort of deeply instilled affection for the Chinese aesthetic that's been with me since youth. Something about it just makes me want to sell opium. The music really helps make it, and that's another thing that sets Genshin apart from its inspirations. It's riddled with orchestration. It's a good thing so many of these tracks are fantastic, because this might otherwise have been a great example of why Breath of the Wild's muted, ambient, subdued score may have been a better course to take for a game where you're going to be hearing it essentially on repeat for hours at a time. The emotional impact of these vistas would almost certainly have been reduced, some might say quite substantially, by a lack of this score, however. So Genshin's is a very pretty face, undeniably. It presents itself with visual polish and auditory aplomb, and it feels very confidently executed for a game that, for me at least, came out of nowhere. The gameplay is of course another beast entirely, and if the gameplay is a beast, then the monetization systems are a shapeless, pestilent nightmare creature from a realm beyond human understanding, wretchedly slithering through the dark passageways of a forgotten city in the dark places of the world. Keep your eyes on your sanity meters, my friends, for we are standing within the mountains of gacha. Now, to lend the subsequent arguments a bit of credence, I feel prompted, if only to cover my tracks like a victim desperately running away from a killer in a slasher film, to state that I have played a decent amount of Fate Grand Order, a decent amount of Grand Blue Fantasy, and a not insignificant amount of Dragalia Lost Girls Frontline and Azure Lane, although not for any substantial length of time. I'm no stranger to games utilizing this method of character acquisition, despite never having spent more than $15 on any one game using this monetization method. So the big issue with Genshin is that it's a gacha game. I mean, yes, obviously, and the big issue with entropy is the inevitable heat death of the universe, but it does bear mentioning all the same with a gacha this miserly. Ebenezer Scrooge would chastise Genshin for being a bit too tight-fisted. Genshin Impact's gacha system works as follows. A single pull from its character lottery is 160 Primogems, which is their free-to-play currency. After 90 pulls, the pity rate kicks in and guarantees a 5-star, either a character or a weapon depending on the pool you're drawing from, and solely to take some of the fun away from the mathematicians amongst you, 90 pulls at 160 gems a pop is 14,400 gems. You can earn 60 from the 4 daily quests, which are, as far as I'm aware, the only major predictable renewable source of gems in the game. That means, on dailies alone, now that I'm on a roll with all this arithmetic, at 60 gems a day, that's a staggering 240 days per 5-star. There's an additional 90 gems per day for 30 days if you buy their little user retention deal $5 monthly login bonus, which brings that 240 down to a cool 96 days and $15 before a guaranteed 5-star, provided you log in and do the commissions every day. I don't hesitate to point out that having to pay for a login bonus is rather ugly as well. They're literally making us pay to habitualize ourselves. Now I'm starting to sound like Rowdy Roddy Piper in They Live. This might be less of an issue provided the daily quests didn't quickly start to feel like needless busy work. They're an utterly blatant grab at your time, and even at 60 Primogems, the rewards don't feel particularly worth it. More often than not, they consist of going to a specified point, killing the 5 to 10 basic enemies there, and then trudging to the next one. If this is their primary method for keeping players invested over the long term, then this is not a good method for keeping players invested over the long term. My experience with Genshin had, 2 or so months after I began playing it, evolved into beginning to start up another game, remembering I had yet to do the commissions in Genshin, sighing and booting that up instead. Then, having completed the commissions, logging out and getting on with what it was I actually wanted to do. Now I barely log in at all anymore. Exploring the world was my main drive to play Genshin, and now that the world as it stands has been largely explored, I'm finding maintaining a presence in Genshin has become a very real chore. Some might say I've played the game too much, but this is service journalism, isn't it? I collected 800 treasure chests in Liyue for you, dear viewer. It's worth noting that opening every single Primogem-enabled chest in Liyue gives you about 14 pulls, give or take, which I'm going to go ahead and call a somewhat insignificant amount of pulls for how much time that requires you to put in. I started viewing the chests as an indication of where I had yet to go, rather than an actual objective in and of themselves, and if your reaction upon seeing a treasure chest is to go, oh, I guess I haven't gone over there yet, then you've probably done a bad job of making them worthwhile. And even that begins to fail when the worthless chests respawn and offer you a solid nothing. Once you hit that content wall, the fun dries up very quickly. Honestly, it feels as though MiHoYo are so desperately terrified that you'll be able to roll a 5-star on free-to-play currency that they've made the rates for doing so amongst the worst I've ever seen in a gacha game, which is certainly saying something, but then they've also gone and made the accrual rate for the currency abysmally low, haven't they? Nasty boys. You could of course get lucky and roll a 5-star on a 10 draw, but since you have a 0.6 chance to draw one, law of averages, that's just not going to happen before the pity rate kicks in. This makes individual rolls functionally useless, since you're not rolling for the rolls themselves, you're rolling for the pity rate. This means that this is a system basically built from the ground up to exploit and encourage whales. I understand that it's a big game and thus requires a steady and reliable source of revenue, but this feels borderline fraudulent, especially considering that the game will never have less characters than it does right now. The already abysmal rates of pulling for a character that you want are only going to get worse from here on out, a problem that may as well just be called Granblue syndrome. Unless this is revamped somehow, I don't know if I'll stick around. Honestly, it feels like every source of Primogems needs to double for this to be acceptable. And it's heartbreaking on some level, because I want to love this game, but I mean, I'm unemployed right now, I don't have the money to whale, and even if I did, I don't like being essentially blackmailed into having an enhanced experience due to the better characters being held ransom to a tune of over $150. Yes, perhaps my reluctance to part with money means I shouldn't complain about not having very good units, but also I wouldn't pay $60 for a game like Genshin Impact, let alone over twice that every other month. I'm not a sucker. Now hold on, my Kiyohime anime figure is looking a bit off kilter. One of the biggest problems with locking higher rarity units behind a random number generator and a potentially massive paywall is that the more complex the gameplay is in your gacha game, the more different your 5 stars are going to be from your lower rarity units. This issue is highlighted nowhere so much as the 5 stars that can literally walk on water and teleport, which makes not having them feel like you're really missing out. By that same token, I presume having them makes exploration a lot less involved, since you can, teleport and walk on water, and the environments must be designed without those abilities in mind, since it's a very real possibility that most people playing the game won't have access to them. Breath of the Wild's iteration of Link can do anything and everything. You're never short on mechanics your controllable character can utilize. The characters of Genshin Impact cannot. To fire a bow, you need to switch to a bow unit. To activate a pyro pedestal, you need to switch to a pyro unit. If you don't have one currently active, you have to open the menu up and reorganize your party. I've lost track of how many times I've stumbled upon an enemy with Geo armor and cursed my almost total lack of Geo units, certainly in my current lineup, leaving me to petulantly wail on them with my extremely tough and cool Fischl, since I happen to roll 6 copies of her. The biggest thing I have against Genshin that isn't the god-awful gacha nightmare that infects its otherwise valiantly beating heart is that it presents Breath of the Wild but without the focus on freedom, and freedom was absolutely instrumental to how that game felt. In Genshin, everything's gated by one thing or another. Content gates, level gates, progress gates, it's ubiquitous. One of my favorite moments in video games in general is the moment where, after finishing the tutorial for BOTW, the quest Defeat Ganon just unceremoniously flashes up on screen and shows you exactly where to find him, not like you needed the help. And what's even cooler about that moment is that you really can go and do that if that's what you want, and many have at this point, but on a more minute level, everywhere you see from the Grand Plateau is somewhere you can go. If you go too far off the current playable map in Genshin Impact, the screen will dim, and you can practically hear the Cockney British military man say, "You're leaving the mission area, get back here." It's not built to recapture a feeling of discovery and exploration that the series it belongs to has lost over the years. It's built to emulate the success of a game that did. It's missing that spark. And this might be a situation where the optimal way to enjoy Genshin is to come back a year or so from now when there's more content and they've hopefully been burned by the Ikarian flight of their exceptionally manipulative gacha and desperately stingy currency dispensation. They've already been throwing out 200 plus Prima Gems daily as a sort of "we apologize for the inconvenience" style commiseration. I especially enjoyed that we got nominated for the best mobile game of the year at Jeff Keighley's annual upcoming game advertisement show. We didn't win, but here's 800 Prima Gems anyway one. That said, seeing how public opinion seems to be kind of turning on the game as people realize that it's got some pretty serious leaks beneath the waterline, I'm reminded of nothing so much as rats leaving a sinking ship, and fundamentally the costs of producing and maintaining a huge experience like this are almost certainly substantially more than even its closest free-to-play competitors. It's not like I don't understand why they've set it up like this, but that doesn't prevent it from being greedy and manipulative, as is the case with many of these games as a service brand treadmills. The sad truth of the comparison to Breath of the Wild is that Breath of the Wild is not a gacha game, which means from the outset they're injecting gacha mechanics into a game design that provably does not need to have them. Imagine if you just had the protagonist who could switch between elements at will using a radial menu, or just had a system where you could buy the 5-star you want for $30, a system they have emphatically stated that they have no plans of implementing. Almost all of Genshin's problems stem from the clash of its gacha systems grinding against an otherwise very pretty, exciting, enjoyable game, at least before you hit that content treadmill. There is a lack of meaningful content in the game at present, and the grinding just isn't for me. There's only so many times I can fight that bloody Pyro Regis vine before I start to see it in my darkest nightmares replacing the face of my father telling me I'm a disappointment. I'm glad they've taken steps to fix the resin situation at least, which is an auto-generated currency that allowed you to receive rewards for completion of certain tasks. I mean, they're listening to feedback, certainly, but I suspect that perhaps the systemic issues that stem from its monetization methods are inevitably going to compromise my experience with it, or, in layman's terms, gacha bad. So with all of that said, and despite throwing out almost 5,000 words explaining my opinion on the game, I'm not sure where I stand on Genshin Impact at present. I've had some absolutely fantastic times playing it, but for me, and perhaps this speaks as to what kind of game-playing individual I am, The lion's share of my enjoyment was seeing what there was to see. Now that I know most of the map like the back of my hand, I've little interest in playing until the next large area, Inazuma, is released sometime in the next few months, likely around February, a solid 5 months after launch. God knows how long it'll take for the rest of the areas to come out, considering there's at least 5 more to go. Expecting me to play until 2023 is a very unique take from MiHoYo, but it's worth remembering. They are trying to save the world, so I can't be too hard on them. Time will tell if Genshin lives up to the potential it absolutely does possess. As it is now, for a free experience, I have difficulty saying it's not worth your time, and for me, the experience of being able to scratch the itch of playing another game like Breath of the Wild was enough to have me completely infatuated with Genshin for the duration of the fortnight or so long honeymoon period. Once the initial joy wore off, though, the shallow, repetitive aspects of the game came into laser focus. And now booting up Genshin is something I have to force myself to do. I have the utmost respect for a company trying to take mobile gaming to a bolder, more enjoyable frontier. I mean, as far as single-player phone games go, Genshin must be up there with the best ever made, surely. I'd love to make another video a year from now detailing how exactly Genshin's fulfilled its promise and is now an absolute must-play, and it was very lovely to be able to experience the relaxing, almost Eurocamp-esque tranquility of having a beautiful, stylized open world to explore, but for better and for worse, Genshin Impact is not and will never be Breath of the Wild.